At the peak of his success, when the company was valued in the billions, when the media called him visionary, when competitors feared him and investors trusted him almost blindly, he made a mistake so subtle that no one noticed it at first, not even him. Because the most dangerous mistakes rarely look like mistakes when they begin. From the outside, everything appeared stable, revenue was growing, expansion was accelerating, and the brand felt untouchable. But internally, a quiet shift had already started. A shift that would later threaten to undo everything he had built. The mistake wasn't greed, recklessness, or arrogance in the way people usually imagine. It was something far more reasonable, far more common, and far harder to detect. He stopped questioning what was working. In the early days, when survival was uncertain, every assumption was challenged, every decision was debated, and every risk was examined closely. But success changed the environment, not overnight, but gradually. Replacing urgency with confidence and caution with momentum, wins began to stack. And with each win, skepticism felt less necessary. Systems that once required constant attention were trusted without verification. Metrics that used to raise red flags were dismissed as temporary noise. The company didn't fail because of a single catastrophic decision. It weakened because of a pattern of small oversights, each one justified by past success. The first warning signs were easy to ignore. A delayed report here, a missed projection there, a talented employee leaving without a clear explanation. None of it dramatic enough to trigger panic, but all of it pointing in the same direction. What he didn't realize was that the empire wasn't being threatened by external competition. It was being eroded internally by assumptions that were no longer true. Growth had outpaced understanding. The organization had become too complex to manage on trust alone. But trust was exactly what he was relying on as the founder. His attention shifted from details to vision, from operations to expansion. And while that shift felt like evolution, it created blind spots that others were afraid to point out. People stopped challenging decisions. Not because they agreed, but because they assumed someone else had already checked the details. Meetings became shorter, questions became softer, and the culture slowly changed from curiosity to compliance. The moment everything almost collapsed didn't arrive suddenly. It arrived disguised as a minor issue, a routine review that uncovered inconsistencies no one could fully explain, numbers that didn't align, processes that no longer matched reality. What started as confusion quickly turned into urgency. Investigations revealed inefficiencies layered on top of each other, misaligned incentives, departments optimizing for their own metrics instead of the company's health, and systems that had grown too large to self-correct. The realization was brutal. The mistake wasn't delegation. The mistake was abdication. He had assumed that because things were working, they would continue to work without scrutiny, and that assumption nearly cost him everything. In that moment, reputation, valuation, and trust were all at risk, not because of one bad actor or one bad decision, but because the feedback loops that once protected the company had quietly disappeared. Fixing the problem required something far harder than strategy. It required humility. He had to slow expansion, reinsert himself into uncomfortable details, invite criticism, and dismantle systems he had personally approved, admitting publicly that something fundamental had been missed. For months, progress reversed, growth stalled, confidence wavered. From the outside, it looked like decline, but internally, something more important was happening. The rebuilding of accountability. Processes were redesigned, metrics were simplified, leadership roles were clarified, and most importantly, questioning was reintroduced as a cultural norm, not as opposition, but as protection. The empire survived, not because it was too big to fail, but because the mistake was caught just before it became irreversible. Years later, when asked about his biggest lesson, he didn't talk about scaling, funding, or competition. He talked about attention, about how success doesn't eliminate risk, it hides it, about how growth without understanding creates fragility. and about how the moment you stop asking uncomfortable questions is the moment your success becomes vulnerable. This story isn't meant to warn against ambition or expansion, but against complacency disguised as confidence, because the higher you climb, the more dangerous it becomes to assume the ground beneath you is solid. The real takeaway isn't what mistake he made, but why it was so easy to make, and how many people are repeating it right now without realizing it. So the question this story leaves you with isn't whether you'll ever make a big mistake, but whether you're paying attention closely enough to catch it while it's still small. Because most empires don't collapse from external attacks, they collapse from internal neglect. If you want more true stories about the hidden failures, near collapses, and silent decisions that shape extreme success, make sure you subscribe. Because the next story reveals how a billionaire avoided total disaster by doing something almost everyone else thought was unnecessary.